You sit in the quiet of your own home, the hum of the refrigerator, a faint familiar companion in the dark. A floorboard creaks somewhere down the hall, and for a split second, your mind doesn't rationalize it as settling wood. Your mind searches for an agent, a presence, a reason for the sound. This reflexive search for a story, for a hidden actor in the silence, is the same machinery that built every ancient myth. And nowhere is that machinery more exposed than in the endings they chose. Ancient myths never let the hero live happily ever after. There is a precise psychological reason for this, and it has nothing to do with cruelty or pessimism. It has to do with what a story is actually for. We have been told, through centuries of fairy tales and Hollywood, that a narrative arc bends toward resolution. The hero suffers, struggles, and is rewarded with a static peace. But the oldest stories on Earth, the ones carved into clay in Sumer, the ones whispered around fires in the Paleolithic, know something we have forgotten. A happy ending is a lie the brain tells itself to stop paying attention. The ancient mind knew that a story that ends is a story that dies. To understand why, you have to understand what a myth actually is. A myth is not a bedtime story. It is a survival algorithm encoded in a narrative. Before writing, before laws, before centralized religion, human groups used myths to transmit the most dangerous and complex knowledge they had. How to hunt a creature that could kill you, how to navigate a landscape that could swallow you, how to negotiate with a neighboring tribe whose intentions you could not read. This is not poetic speculation. This is the function of narrative as understood by evolutionary psychology and cognitive science. Over the last 40 years, researchers like anthropologist Pascal Boyer and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett have laid out a compelling case. The human brain is not a general-purpose logic engine. It is a story engine, optimized for detecting agents, inferring intentions, and building causal models of events that unfold over time. A myth that ends happily ever after teaches the brain that the problem is solved. The danger is gone. The circuit closes. The brain stops attending. It stops transmitting the survival information to the next generation. A myth that leaves the hero broken, wandering, or cursed keeps the circuit open. It keeps the listener in a state of unresolved attention, a state where the survival algorithm continues to be rehearsed, refined, and passed on. Look at the earliest written story we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed on clay tablets around 1800 before the Common Era in the city of Uruk. Gilgamesh is 2/3 god, 1/3 human, the strongest and most arrogant king who ever lived. He loses his only friend, Enkidu, and is so shattered by grief that he abandons his kingdom to seek immortality. He crosses the waters of death, finds the secret plant of eternal youth, and then loses it to a snake while he is bathing. The story does not end with him conquering death and ruling forever in joy. It ends with him standing at the walls of his own city, exhausted, mortal, and accepting that he will die. That is the ending. He goes home. He is not happy. He is not rewarded. He is initiated into the reality of his own limits, and that initiation is the entire point of the narrative. If the scribes had written that Gilgamesh found the plant, ate it, and lived forever in bliss, the story would have been forgotten within a generation. It would have been a fairy tale, a piece of entertainment with no cognitive weight, but because he fails, because the ending is unresolved and painful, the story has been told for nearly 4,000 years. The failure is the feature. The open loop is the survival mechanism. Now consider a different kind of narrative failure, one that does not just happen to the hero, but is built into the structure of the world. The Greek myths, the ones collected by Homer and Hesiod around the 8th century before the Common Era, are saturated with a concept called nemesis. It is not just vengeance. It is the cosmic force that ensures balance. If a hero rises too high, if they achieve too much, nemesis will pull them back down. This is not a moral lesson about humility. This is a cognitive bias encoded in narrative form. Social dominance hierarchy is one of the most dangerous landscapes a human navigates. The person at the top is a target. The person who rises too fast invites coalitional envy and destruction. A myth that shows Icarus flying too close to the sun and falling is not telling you about wax and feathers. It is telling you about the social physics of a small group, where the one who claims too much status is destroyed by the collective. This is the truth that the happy ending obscures. In the world of the ancient myth, there is no final victory. There is only the endless cycle of rise and fall, of order and chaos, of life and death. The stories that survived are the ones that mirrored that cycle. They did not give the listener a comfortable resolution. They gave the listener a pattern to recognize, a danger to anticipate, a fate to avoid. Consider the figure of the trickster, found in cultures across every continent. The trickster is Coyote in the stories of the Native American peoples of the Great Plains. The trickster is Ishu in the Yoruba tradition of West Africa. The trickster is Loki in the Norse sagas, recorded in the 13th century in Iceland. The trickster never wins. The trickster disrupts, creates chaos, sometimes brings fire or knowledge to humans, but always ends up punished, mocked, or trapped. Loki is bound with the entrails of his own son, a snake dripping venom onto his face until the world ends. Coyote is often outwitted by the very creatures he tried to deceive. Aishu sows confusion and is never fully trusted. These are not happy endings. These are cautionary tales about the cost of disruption, and they survive because the need to understand the cost of disruption is eternal. Every human group has a trickster, someone who breaks the rules for gain or amusement. The myth teaches the group what happens when that person goes too far. The happy ending would imply that disruption is safe, that order can be restored without cost. The trickster myth says the opposite. The cost is permanent. The pattern is ongoing. The danger never fully passes. The psychological mechanism behind this is called counterintuitive bias. Boyer and his colleagues have shown that narratives that violate a few basic intuitive expectations are more memorable than narratives that confirm them. A ghost that walks through walls violates our intuitive physics. A spirit that knows your thoughts violates our intuitive psychology. These violations make the story stick in the mind. The happy ending is intuitive. It confirms the expectation that effort should lead to reward, that good should triumph, that struggle should end in peace. Because it is intuitive, it is forgettable. The unhappy ending is counterintuitive. Effort leads to loss. Good is punished. Struggle continues with no resolution. This violation of expectation forces the brain to rehearse the narrative to try to resolve the cognitive dissonance. And in that rehearsal, the survival information is transmitted. This is also why the most powerful myths do not just end unhappily for the hero. They end with the hero becoming something other than human. Achilles chooses a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. He gets glory, but he dies young, and his ghost tells Odysseus that he would rather be a slave among the living than a king among the dead. His happy ending was a lie, and he tells you so, from the underworld. Orpheus goes to the underworld to retrieve his wife, Eurydice. He is allowed to bring her back on one condition. He must not look back at her until they reach the surface. He looks back. He loses her forever. The story is not about the joy of reunion. It is about the fragility of trust, the unbearable weight of doubt, the permanent cost of a single moment of weakness. The ending is a wound that never heals, which is why it has been told for 2,500 years. But here's where the evidence gets personal. We have all been told at some point in our lives that we should try to achieve a happy ending, that if we work hard enough, are good enough, we will be rewarded with peace. This idea is a cultural artifact of a very recent, very specific historical development. The printing press, the rise of the novel, and the mass market for entertainment in the 19th century created the demand for satisfying resolutions. The fairy tales collected by the Brothers Grimm in the early 19th century were originally much darker. In the first edition of 1812, the evil queen is forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dies at Cinderella's wedding. Snow White's stepmother is not just defeated. She is brought to the wedding and forced into a pair of shoes heated in a fire until she drops dead. The Disney version sanded off these endings. They replaced the cost of the story with a feeling of resolution, and in doing so, they broke the cognitive function of the myth. The happy ending teaches the brain that the problem is solved. The dark ending teaches the brain that the problem is ongoing, that the cost is real, that the danger is never fully gone. One is a piece of entertainment. The other is a survival tool. This is the point where you realize that the stories you were told as comfort were actually edited versions of something older and more honest. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden architecture of the stories that shape your life, subscribe. There is a reason these narratives survive across millennia, and we are only beginning to map it. Before you move on, drop the name of a fairy tale whose original dark ending you remember, the version where the villain does not just lose, but pays in full. This distinction matters because we are still using these ancient narrative structures, whether we know it or not. The most watched and most discussed television series of the last 20 years, shows like Breaking Bad, The Wire, Game of Thrones, set video on demand, all of them are built on the ancient architecture of the unhappy ending. Walter White does not get cured and return to his family. He dies alone in a meth lab, having destroyed everyone he loved. Tony Soprano sits in a diner, and the screen goes black. The ending is not delivered. The loop is left open. The audience is forced to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, and that discomfort makes the story stick in the mind for years. The creators of these shows, whether they know the cognitive science or not, are using the same architecture that built Gilgamesh. This is the part most people miss. The ancient myths were not just stories. They were models of a world that is fundamentally unsafe, a world where the hero does not get to rest because the threat is not external. The threat is the structure of reality itself. The gods are capricious. Fate is indifferent. The self is fragile. A happy ending in that world would be a lie, and the brain knows a lie when it hears one. The brain trusts the story that hurts. There is a finding from the psychology of narrative that illustrates this beautifully. In a landmark study from the early 2000s by psychologists Melanie Green and Timothy Brock, participants read stories with different endings. The ones with unexpected, slightly negative endings were rated as more profound, more meaningful, and more memorable than the ones with happy, predictable endings. The brain does not seek pleasure from narrative. It seeks pattern recognition and threat anticipation. The story that makes you uncomfortable is the story your brain trusts. This brings us to a question that might feel uncomfortable. If you have ever felt that a story with a perfect happy ending felt hollow, flat, or forgettable, you were not being cynical. You were being honest with your own cognition. Your brain was telling you that the story was not real, that it was a piece of soothing fiction rather than a map of the actual territory. The ancient storytellers knew this. They did not give you comfort. They gave you truth. Now consider the myth that is perhaps the most uncomfortable of all. The story of Oedipus, as told by Sophocles in the 5th century before the Common Era in Athens. Oedipus solves the riddle of the Sphinx, becomes king, marries the queen, and lives in prosperity for years. Then a plague hits Thebes, and he sets out to find the cause. The cause is him. He killed his father and married his mother. His success was built on a crime he did not know he committed. When the truth comes out, his mother, Jocasta, hangs herself. Oedipus blinds himself with the pins from her dress and wanders into exile, a beggar, led by his daughter. This is the happiest of all possible endings. No, this is the most honest ending the ancient world ever produced. The hero succeeds, and success is the trap. The truth is the punishment. The cost of knowledge is permanent. This is the engine of the myth. It is not about fate or prophecy. It is about the terror of the self. The story that checks the hero's pride is a story that keeps the social group alive. The story that ends in exile and blindness is a story that the brain cannot forget. If you have ever looked at your own life and felt that your successes were built on something you could not see, that the cost of your choices was hidden from you until it was too late, you know the feeling that Oedipus felt when he stood in the court of his own palace, blind and ruined. The myth gave you the language for that feeling. Now let us look at a tradition that made the open ending into a formal, sacred principle. The Buddhist Jataka tales, recorded around the 3rd century before the Common Era, tell the previous lives of the Buddha. In each life he is a bodhisattva, a being on the path to enlightenment, and in each life he performs a perfect act of self-sacrifice. He gives his body to a starving tigress. He offers his head to a beggar. He jumps into a pit of fire. And in none of these stories does he achieve enlightenment. He does not get the happy ending. He keeps rebirthing, keeps sacrificing, keeps failing to reach the final goal. The narrative itself is structured as an endless cycle, like the samsara it describes. The story cannot end because enlightenment cannot be narrated. It can only be experienced. The Buddhist tradition discovered something that the cognitive scientists are still catching up on. The happy ending is a conceptual impossibility for certain truths. The truth of impermanence, the truth of suffering, the truth of no self cannot be resolved into a satisfying final scene. They can only be held, examined, and released. The story that ends in contentment is a story that has stopped teaching. This is the hidden layer of meaning that the ancient myths carry. They are not failed attempts at happy endings. They are deliberately designed open loops, survival algorithms in narrative form, crafted by millennia of cultural evolution to keep the human mind engaged with the most dangerous truths. The hero does not live happily ever after, because that would end the story, and the story must never end. Now, here's the part that begins to touch you directly. If you have ever found yourself drawn to stories that leave you unsettled, stories that refuse to give you the resolution you thought you wanted, you are not a glutton for punishment. You are responding to a deep ancient cognitive need. You are seeking the weight of truth over the lightness of comfort. Think about the last story that stayed with you for days, that you could not stop turning over in your mind. It was probably not the one where everyone got exactly what they deserved. It was the one where something remained broken, where a question was left unanswered, where a character walked away into a silence that you are still trying to interpret. That is the mythic structure working on your mind. So what does your brain actually do with these unresolved narratives? This is where the psychology becomes concrete. In the early 2000s, a team of researchers led by psychologist Piotr Winkelmann studied what happens in the brain when a narrative pattern is disrupted. They found that unexpected endings trigger a measurable increase in cognitive processing and emotional arousal. The brain does not shut off. It leans in. This is the exact opposite of the happy ending effect, which triggers a drop in both processing and arousal. The brain says, pattern recognized, problem solved, story complete, and begins to disengage. The open loop keeps the brain in a state of active attention, and attention is the currency of survival, both in the ancestral environment and in the digital world of content consumption. But there is a deeper and more unsettling reason why the ancients refused to let their heroes rest. It is not just about memory, it is about identity. The hero who fails, who suffers, who is left wandering, is a mirror for the self. The hero who achieves perfect happiness is a fantasy that the self can admire from a distance. The hero who is wounded and broken is a model the self can inhabit when it is wounded and broken. The hero who is wounded and broken is a mirror for the self, and that mirror is what the ancients knew you would need. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden architectures of the mind, the structures that shape how you survive loss and meaning, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments which story, whether myth or film, left you with a hero still wandering, a wound still open. That wound is the rehearsal space we are about to examine. This is the psychological function of the unhappy ending. It provides a rehearsal space for loss. The brain practices defeat through narrative so that when real defeat comes, the pattern is familiar. The emotions are pre-processed. The self is not shattered because the story has already shown it, the shape of the fall. Research in narrative psychology by scholars like Dan McAdams has shown that individuals who construct their life stories around themes of redemption, the struggle leading to a positive outcome, tend to have higher well-being. But the ancient myths are not about redemption. They are about initiation. The hero does not come back better. The hero comes back changed, marked, often worse. And the community that hears the story is initiated into the same truth. This is the function of the myth of the wounded healer. Chiron the centaur, in Greek myth, is immortal, but wounded by a poisoned arrow that will not heal. He cannot die. He cannot recover. He exists in permanent agony. His name became the source of the word surgery, and he is the one who teaches Asclepius, the god of medicine. The wound is the source of the teaching. The unhappy ending is the curriculum. If you have ever learned more from a failure than from a success, if you have ever found that the most valuable lessons of your life came from the moments that broke you, you have experienced the truth that the ancient myths encoded. The happy ending is a luxury of a world that has forgotten what stories are for. So when the scribe in Uruk recorded that Gilgamesh returned to his city walls, exhausted and mortal, he was not writing a sad ending. He was writing the only ending that could carry the truth. The hero does not conquer death. The hero learns to live with the knowledge of death, and that knowledge, not the immortality he sought, is the real gift. The myth gave it to you. This is why the myths survive. They are not artifacts of a superstitious past. They are finely tuned cognitive tools, shaped by a process as ruthless as natural selection. The stories that made the brain attend, remember, and transmit, those are the stories that survived. The ones that offered comfort and closure were forgotten. The ones that offered initiation and open wounds became the foundation of human culture. And here is the uncomfortable conclusion. The myth is still alive. It is still working on you. Every time you find yourself unable to let go of a story that hurt you, every time you replay a moment of failure or loss in your mind, you are participating in the same mechanism that kept Gilgamesh alive for 4,000 years. Your brain is not punishing you. It is transmitting the pattern of survival. The hero cannot live happily ever after because the hero is you, and your story is not finished. It does not have an ending yet. That open loop, that unresolved ache at the end of every myth, is the space where your own narrative continues. The ancient storytellers did not give you a resolution because they knew you would have to find your own. Think about the stories of your own life and consider the ones that have stuck with you the most. Have they been the ones where everything worked out perfectly? Or have they been the ones where something is still unresolved, still open? Why do you think that is? Send this to someone who understands that an ending is just a beginning you haven't recognized yet. The next video will examine what happens when, instead of walking into exile, the hero walks into the dark forest, and what the forest teaches that the city never could. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson the myths carry. They do not lie about the shape of existence. They do not promise that the wound heals or that the search ends. They hand you a story that stays broken, and in that break, they admit that you will stay broken too. Not defeated, but open, unfinished, still attentive. The hero does not live happily ever after. The hero lives honestly with the knowledge of the cost. And perhaps, in that honesty, there is something the brain recognizes as more true than any resolution could ever provide. The ancient scribes, the storytellers around Paleolithic fires, the poets of every culture, they all understood one thing that we are only now relearning. A story that ends is a story that dies. An open loop is a story that lives inside you. And so the myth does not end. It waits.